Hi, my name is Frank Fredericks, and I'm the founder of World Faith. I want you to believe that communal violence is solvable. I know that's an unusual thing to start off with, but I find that we live in a unique time when we live in a time that is the most peaceful point in human history, and yet we seem to assume that violence is intractable. So I want to tell you about my journey to coming to believe this, and hopefully I invite you to join in that belief by the end. So I grew up in the rural Pacific Northwest in the mountains north of Portland, Oregon. And I remember when I was actually about 8 years old and saw Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and decided I'm going to move to New York. Now, being first generation educated, people where I was from didn't go to places like New York. But when I turned 18, I got into NYU and I moved to New York and got to sort of live the dream of pursuing what I thought was my passion at the time in the music industry. But living in such a diverse place, I was struck by having an opportunity to discuss and learn from people different than myself, but having no real basis to develop those meaningful relationships. And so this led me to go to Egypt to conduct independent research on Christian-Muslim relations. And it was there that I found that young people tolerate each other and they can coexist. And these are terms that I don't like to use. But all it took is for somebody to throw a rock through the window of a church or mosque for 6 to be dead by morning. So what made violence so easy, and why was it always young people who were engaging in this violence? I came back to New York with this sort of feeling and calling to do something about this. And as I started meeting with the existing interfaith organizations at the time, I found that most were focused on getting religious leaders together for dialogue. This is important work, of course, but I just don't believe that old people talking can counter young people taking action. And communal violence is largely led by young people and who are both the perpetrators and victims of that violence. So it was from that I felt inspired to found World Faith. World Faith's mission is to end religious violence. We do this through something called contact theory, that if you build a positive relationship with one person from another community, you can improve how you see that entire community, particularly under certain conditions, collaborating with a shared objective, working towards that, over a period of time, having an impartial third party, and feeling like you're equals throughout that process. So through this, World Faith developed a chapter-based model in which young people across the world are able to take our model and particularly apply it into different spaces. And we're going to talk through some of those spaces. We started at New York University in 2006, and then officially became a nonprofit in 2008. It was there that we got some of our first grant funding and began to expand internationally with a chapter in Lebanon. And today we actually have chapters in 8 countries. These chapters are working on important issues, including early child education, women's empowerment, and public health. And through this work, we've been able to see over 6,000 volunteers do 400,000 hours of service, directly impacting the lives of about 500,000 people. And so in the 12 years I've been doing this work, I've come to believe that violence is solvable, and yet have found that I'm uniquely believing that. That's not a common thing. When you read the news or you hear conversations at the dinner table, we accept violence as if it's this thing that's always been here and will always be. And I'm not sure I completely agree with that. So I want to walk you through this question of, can we really end religious violence? Is violence solvable? Is communal violence at large solvable? Well, let's talk about it. First of all, most people don't think that violence is solvable. The Rockefeller Foundation did a study and asked, which SDG do you think is most solvable in a generation? And you'll see that the top one was ending hunger, all the way down to goal 16, which is peace, justice, and strong institutions, basically peace building. In other words, twice as many people actually thought we can eliminate poverty in the world, something that affects 900 million people, versus peace and violence, something that takes maybe 100,000 lives a year. So clearly there seems to be some sort of detachment between the sense of where we are at this moment, and that people really don't think violence is a solvable issue. And it's understandable. It's salient. It disturbs us to our core. When we see communal violence, it's something that shakes us internally in a way that some of the abstract forms of suffering we see are just less salient and less moving in that moment. There's a certain fear that comes out of seeing communal violence, both in that we don't want to be victim to this, but also it scares us to see the humanity both in the perpetrator and the victims of violence. So why does communal violence happen? What is leading into this? So there are a ton of reasons why violence happens, but I want to just get into a couple of main characteristics that are fundamentally human that lead to violence. First of all, a big overarching theme that I really want to present here is that violence isn't an aberration of the human condition, or this idea that we are born peaceful and we are, taught how to be violent. I actually believe, and I think increasingly research shows, that aspects of violence are very much innate into the human condition, and it's whether or not certain conditions are met that violence happens. And I just want this framing to be one that we might look at and we take with us as we go through this. And this isn't like a new debate. You can even go all the way back to the Hobbes-Rousseau debate around, are we, is the state creating a more peaceful form of us, or were we once peaceful in the wilderness and now society has ruined us? This is a long-running debate. So the first is there's a fundamental aspect to human nature to have an in-group and an out-group. Whether it's tribe or language or ethnicity or nationality or sports team, we by default tend to create an us and them mentality. And this is particularly useful if you look into history from the perspective of being in a resource-shy environment and needing to essentially take care of you, your own, and the people closest to you. Children, infants, can show racial and linguistic bias as young as 6 months. Through research that's been done. So we know this is something that's pretty much hard-coded into us. As to which groups are the in-group or out-group, that can change. We also have something called false pattern recognition. We are hypersensitive to anything happening around us to the point that we see patterns that may not actually exist. This is where a lot of superstitions come from. I rub my elbow before I shoot the free throw, therefore I make it. That must be why it works. But it's also easy to see why we could have evolved for this. Let's say you hear a rustle in the bush, and it's 10,000 years ago in the jungle. You hear this rustle. Is it a tiger or is it the wind? Now, if you think it's the wind and it's the wind, you live. If you think it's the wind and it's a tiger, you get eaten. If you think it's a tiger and it's a tiger, you live. And if you think it's a tiger and it's the wind, you live. So clearly people who underestimate the presence of tigers will be killed off, and the people who think every rustle in the bush is a tiger lives. So we've actually evolved to be hypersensitive to false patterns. Next is Dunbar's number, which probably coincides with this creation of in-group, out-group, but we basically can only really maintain meaningful relationships with about 150 people. And it may be because of the amount of resource limitations in one valley before they were farming, or another idea is because our brains contract the different relationships between people. That's about how many different reputations and also the ability to tell gossip, as a means of creating safety in numbers. There's a lot of different theories around this. We know that the amygdala and other parts of the brain can be triggered to go into a fight, flight, freeze mode. And there's, or as Steven Pinker calls it, the rage circuit is another sort of extension of this, in which we can act in super violent ways in short periods of time that can dramatically impact, our violent behavior. Next, you can also see that there are, ways in which there are chemicals that are part of our biology that can increase or decrease our tendency towards violence. And one study, I just mentioned here testosterone and serotonin. I actually saw a study this last year which looked at climate change and how our bodies produce more or less serotonin based on the temperature, and that there could be actually an increase in violence just due to serotonin levels as a result of climate change. There's also some sociological aspects. For instance, Michael Kimmel in his book, Healing from Hate, talks about something called the aggrieved entitlement of masculinity. And when comparing neo-Nazis in Europe, far right-wing extremists in the US, and so-called Islamic extremists, that he found each of them across these different groups had a tendency to believing there was some prototypical form of masculinity that they thought they were entitled to, not just was possible, but that they were entitled to, and they felt that they were denied that, and that seemed to correlate strongly with their tendency towards violence. And we can even see similarities of that pattern among gang violence in Latin America, the Americas in general. And then lastly, we even know from Daniel Kahneman's research that we have a strong tendency to be loss averse, but be willing to take big risks to avoid losing. And so there's this relationship between the pain of losing $5 being greater than the joy of gaining $5. But when we feel like we're going to lose something, we are more likely to behave in ways that we typically wouldn't, including violence. So these are just some of the mechanisms that lead to violent behaviors. So if we have all of this software plugged into us that makes it very easy for us to be violent, why does the world suck so much? Why are we so violent? You know, it seems like, oh, it's all because of these pieces that are driving us. Yet here's a really important chart. If you see here, this is your likelihood of dying a violent death as a human over the last 600 years. And you can see it varies from time to time. But if you see the blue line towards the end, it's at an all-time low. We live actually in the most peaceful time in human history. So despite the fact that we feel like this violence is intractable, and despite the fact that there seems to be so many different forms and ways that violence is driven within us on the individual level, we're actually doing pretty good right now. And so it's helpful to take stock of where we are at this moment. And so the truth is, we're not actually living in a violent time. The world doesn't suck as much as we think it does. And on here, I just want you to see where conflict is on this list. If you go all the way down, the fourth from the bottom is conflict. You'll see the second from the bottom is terrorism. And even if you want to include homicide, it's below malaria and above nutritional deficiencies. So your likelihood of dying a death of conflict is extremely low. And yet, when you look at the way that the news responds to things, it tends to make us feel that our violent death is always imminent. And it might be a product of our wiring or whatever else, but we clearly feared violence more than it actually is happening. And so I think that's important, because I think that overstated fear also leads to our inability to imagine a world where violence isn't happening. So let's move forward with this. Why does it feel like we're not making progress then? Okay, we see that people don't believe violence is solvable, and we also see that that we're actually doing really well in violence. I think this chart does a really great job of driving that home. This is from the Institute of Economics and Peace. You can see the biggest square is about the $14.3 trillion the world loses in productivity and other costs to violence and peacekeeping and everything involved. Then you can see in this bottom corner, military, which is about 5.6 trillion. These are all PPP adjusted. So yeah, the world is spending trillions of dollars on military spending. And then I don't know if you can even see in the tiny corner, bottom right, you'll see peace. This little tiny square of $15 billion. Well, despite the fact that we made so much progress, violence is still a problem. It's a $14 trillion problem, and we're spending $15 billion trying to solve it. That's like trying to take a $14,000 problem and solve it with $15 in your pocket. We're just not putting the resources where we need to. And so I would say we're not really making much progress at this moment. I say ish. There's some really good work that's happening, and I don't want to speak ill of the great work other people are doing, but by and large, we're not making much progress because we're not putting resources in the right places. So while social progress is being made across other issues, peace building is not keeping pace with that productivity in terms of better outcomes. I think there's a few barriers to progress why this is happening, and some of it has to do, these particular ones are research oriented. I think one of the reasons why it's difficult to create more innovation in the peace building space is that you always have a challenge of low probability occurrences. When you're trying to find something that happens as infrequently as violence, every heuristic that you use to determine who or what violence is or who could be engaged in violence, majority of people who meet that criteria will not be violent. So let's say you say, okay, young men or unemployed young men or certain economic conditions, or you could say maybe people who've experienced trauma or who have elevated levels of testosterone. You can create all these different parameters. But when you layer them all on top of each other and you have a sample population, within the still majority of the people who meet those conditions will not be violent. And so that's really important that we actually are not great at sort of filtering appropriately. And this it's a statistical issue that if you use Bayes' theorem, you'll actually find where that sort of breaks down, when you get to low probability occurrences. The second issue is most of the research is done using self-reporting. Whereas in behavioral economics, we've been able to find lots of amazing ways to look at people's behaviors and use that to create better working models of all sorts of different things. The way that social science treats violence usually is self-reported. You're asking people to either talk about their beliefs or what they think, or even surmise their future action. And we know from the sociability effect and the Hawthorne effect that self-reporting typically is going to end up being less usable or less friendly to what you need. The third issue is we have a generalizability issue. There's incredible research being done, but there is a tendency of those doing that research to assume there's nothing generalizable with happening in one place to another. And indeed, there are many conflict-specific issues. But I do believe if we start to do meta-analyses across different projects and use shared data, that we might actually find some generalizable aspects and use that to better create working models. And the last is there's confounding factors. I've mentioned several factors, but it's even difficult as we look at different factors to figure out what is the causal factor versus what just correlates. There's a great book called The Moral Consequence of Economic Growth by Benjamin Friedman, and he looks at changes in real home wealth or home income as a means to look at civil discord and animosity towards minorities and immigration across the world. And it's really amazing, but it's you see the correlation, but we don't know if it's causal. And there's all sorts of these different issues that I think better research can help us with. So here's really what I want to present is we need a few things to move the conversation forward. And I think there's three things that will immensely help our field take huge steps forward towards ending violence. The first is catalytic philanthropy. So catalytic philanthropy is like venture capitalism, but in the philanthropic space. We need folks who are willing to fund new innovative ideas that are statistically likely to fail, but if they break through, will have a huge magnifying effect for the field at large. There are many different researchers and folks creating things that are not getting funding to test those new ideas, because traditional philanthropy is very much, okay, here's the funding, go do this thing, fill out the logic model, send it back to us. We need to understand that risk is inherent in innovation, and we need to reward some of that risk-taking right now in our field. The second is called collective impact assessment approach. And in particular, I have found among some of the best peace-building organizations that there's an understanding that we need shared metrics, but we haven't got to a point where we're actually implementing that in an effective way. And what I mean is, if you're using one ruler and I'm using a different ruler, we can't take our data sets of different projects and actually see if there's anything generalizable between them. And so I think collective impact assessment approaches will be a huge opportunity to move the field forward with the existing resources we have and actually start to look at some of the generalizable opportunities that come out of that data. And then the third is there's some incredible research that already exists, but there are, I would say, not helpful incentives on academics towards publishing and all the things that happen in academia that are not optimized towards being applicable in the field. So I think among the way that research is happening today, being able to get researchers, policymakers, and practitioners to create hypotheses and premises for researchers to go test and develop, which could also be using catalytic philanthropy and pulling from these universal data sets and the other thing, but basically creating more cross collaboration among those fields so that research is being designed with impact on the field in mind, which just isn't how it's done most of the time today. So those are the opportunities that we have before us. And to sort of show you what's possible, I wanted to present this chart. This is a chart that looks at smallpox over the last about 100 years, yeah. And what we know is that there were an estimated 300 million cases of smallpox, and and hundreds of millions of deaths basically came out of this disease over this period. More than war. More people died in the last century of smallpox than they did of war. And if you look here at the very end, look at 1977 and beyond, there's nothing there. People thought that smallpox was here to stay, that this is the world that we live in, that that we have no ability to influence the outcome of this, so we just need to accept this. But then some people thought, well, we could do some better research. We could test this out. We have a good idea. We have a vaccine. We need resources to scale this. We need to get this to the right people. We need to hit a certain threshold so that we can actually have herd immunity. And suddenly we live in a world without smallpox. One of the largest killers of the last century no longer is an issue that we have to think about. If we have the same amount of dedication, of strategic forethought, I believe that we can end communal violence in the next generation. And so this is the framework by which I invite us to imagine violence being solvable. Thank you so much for your time, and feel free to reach out if you want to continue this conversation. Thank you.